So I will be present on the project of a Constitución Política de la República de Chile. So this is the volume that came out of that process. Because I think although it has failed, as we all know, and much certainty reigns what will be the future, I think that one thing is certain, and that is that this project, the outcome that it adds to the thought on global constitutionalism, and that is why I'm presenting it here. And I will do so in three steps. I will start by some thoughts on the process of the convention. Then I will go into some of the innovations of the convention, and then I will go into an evaluation what are next steps. So on the process, so I think that most of you are familiar with it, but I briefly recall some important elements. So it started on October 1, 2019, for a raise in the cost of transit fares. And we had it the other time, so don't make traffic more expensive. It's the most explosive thing that you can do, either if it is gasoline or anything. Don't touch the transit fares. It's highly risky. And so it was in Chile, although it was a very small amount of money. It triggered mass demonstration. Traffic in the capital collapsed, and several subway stations were vandalized. So after 2 weeks, on October 19, the president declared the state of emergency. And that meant that for the first time since the return to democracy, the military could control citizens. And that did not calm down the situation, but rather escalated it. So Chile had the biggest demonstrations ever, with more than 1 million people taking over the streets. So it was clear that more than just a fare rise was at stake. At that point of escalation, the president, who was a conservative, switched to a forward-looking way. So instead of beating up the people, he rather invited them into a political process. And indeed, he proposed on November 12th to elaborate a new constitution, not just a constitutional amendment, but a new constitution. And already on November 15th, so just in 3 days, the government succeeded an agreement with most of the parties represented in Congress on the way ahead. So there was an agreement on social peace and the new constitution. And then on 23 December, then Congress enacted a constitutional amendment for the path. So it's very important. The Chileans said we will have a new constitution, but there will be no constitutional rupture. So it should be sterling legality, which is important. So Congress enacted a constitutional amendment, and Congress also laid down the key points of the convention's operation, as well as, importantly, a plebiscite on the outcome. So, there would be a referendum on the path, and there would be a referendum on the outcome, and the latter one would be obligatory. Very important. And at the time, that the people did not see. Moreover, it put some issues of limits, such as the status of the republic, democracy, international treaties ratified, and the finality of judgments. It also said that for any proposal to go into the draft, it needed a 2/3 requirement in the convention. So not every article that went into it, a 2/3 requirement was needed on every single clause. The law also required parity between men and women among members. That was a global first. And it reserved 11% of the places for representatives for monocracies. Moreover, and that is also important, it gave candidates who were not affiliated with political parties a true opportunity to be elected. So that was then ratified in the first plebiscite on on October 25, 2020, then COVID came. And that was a big problem because the whole dynamic was broken. So more than a year later, there was the plebiscite. And the election were only in May 21, so a year and a half after the whole thing has happened. Now, there were 155 convention members, of which 17 were sent by the chiefs of the pueblos, and only 85 people belonged to political parties. All other people, members, were independent, which shows many things. One is the deep problem of political representation in Chile. But what is also important is that more than a third of the people in the convention had a law degree. So there was legal knowledge. Then the convention worked for a year up to July 21. From July 21 to July 22, and then it was rejected, the proposal in September. Now, some reflections on that process. The first thing which I find interesting is the potency of an inclusive constitutional process to de-escalate a very critical situation. So again, in October of 2019, an intervention by the military seemed possible. So in Chile, everybody knows what that means. The Pinochet years were still very present. Also, the very high efficiency of the Chilean repression. The Chileans killed only a tenth of what the Argentinians killed. So it was a very, very effective repression. So that was written on the walls, but the initiation of an inclusive constitutional process overcame that danger and channeled it into an institutional exit that aims at peace and social justice, as the November agreement says. So that constitutional process really processed some raw popular energy, that type of popular energy that constitutional theorists usually assume as the basis of a constitution, which very rarely is the case. Very often it's a new constitution, it's a political process as so many others. But sometimes it is something very special. And here in Chile, it had that energy. It very much helped for that, and that is in a way an irony, that the Chile's current constitution, which originated in 1980 under Pinochet, was highly illegitimate. Highly illegitimate because it was entrenching his neoliberal remodeling of the Chilean society. And just by the way, on 27th February, we will have here Javier Causo, who is one of the main constitutional lawyers in Chile who have theorized that neoliberal constitution, and he will be speaking here at the end of the month. And he will inform us on what it will be the next steps in Chile. So it is a deeply illegitimate constitution. And although after the return to democracy in 89 and 90, a lot of reforms have been done to the constitution, it is still a symbol of an unfair constitution. And so there was a common aim to change that constitution. Now we come to the innovations. So the convention's proposal failed. And that, of course, is a huge topic. And then the reason for that, they were the topic of the 51st Jornadas Chilenas de Derecho Público. So it is a yearly gathering of the Chilean public lawyers, constitutional, administrative, and international lawyers. And I happened to be invited to that conference to give a talk, but good academic practice, when you have done your talk, you don't walk away and go to the museums, but you stay there and you listen to the others. It's good academic practice. So I practiced that. And I tell you, it was very interesting. There were 3 days. There were more than 85 presentations on all kinds of issues of that failure. And that was highly informative, and I'm telling you now about what I learned. The first thing what I found striking is that although the Chilean society is deeply entrenched and almost every political affiliation has its university. So the truly conservative forces, they have the Universidad Católica, which drafted the Pinochet constitution. And the even harder guys, they are at Los Andes with the Opus Dei. And then there are the progressive ones. So almost every political outlook has its university. But they came together, and it was a very civilized affair. Yeah, it was surprisingly friendly and constructive. So how to read the project's failure? And one interesting thing is that there was broad agreement for what, why it failed. I know. Before I do that, so how to read that? You know, to read that you need some theory to read it. Now, what kind of theory did I use to read it? I relied on this book. It's Mario Fernandez Baeza. I can pass it around. And for several reasons. First, he's from Heidelberg. You know, he did his doctoral degree here with Dieter Nohlen about 80 years ago or so. No, not that. And he wrote in the 70s. He was then a professor of public law at the University of Chile. Then he was a judge at the Constitutional Court, Minister of Defense under President Lagos, and Minister of the Interior, as well as Vice President under President Bachelet, who already did a project for a new constitution that was then thwarted by the conservative forces. Very briefly, last time I was in Chile, I visited him in his office, and it was very impressive. So you visit the vice president, the minister of the interior. His office was as big as mine, not more than that, and it's not. The heating was a butano, you know, a gas thing that you have in your room, no central heating. So it was very modest. But on the wall like that, there was the structure of the organized violence in the country. So if ever I have seen what it means that the state is a unity of action, there it was. You know, the full chain of command with the people in charge, and where you go to have exercised the legitimate violence in the country. It was a very impressive thing. So he had been in all the former projects, even particularly under the one of President Bachelet, but he deliberately did not participate in this one. But he looked at it again as a scholar. So I take his key. Now, what does he write? And how does he explain and even justifies the proposal's failure? And I can tell you, I also had a meeting with ICAL Chile there, and all our friends, they were really very, very, very sad for what has happened. But he makes a good argument, and it helps to understand it. So he says, so what does it take to understand what a constitution is? A constitution has to be looked at in two ways. A constitution is a political agreement, and a constitution is a juridical norm. So a good constitution needs to respond to both dimensions. As a political agreement, a constitution should rely on support by as many political forces as possible. But as a juridical norm, it must respond to the requirements of precision, consistency, and legal operationality. So these are the two dimensions. Now, what is the main problem in terms of political agreement? Here, there was very broad agreement that there were 4 issues. Now, the issue was that the convention members did not reach out sufficiently to the conservative forces. Now, how was that possible? It was possible because the progressive, for the independence and for the moment of time, they had a 2/3 majority in the convention. Nevertheless, in the later election, it was clear that that 2/3 majority did not correspond to the mood of the country. Nevertheless, the progressive thought that for the referendum on the outcome, it only took a simple majority. So they said, we can win it and we can enshrine our progressive vision for Chile for all the time to come. What they overlooked is what I told you at the beginning. The outcome referendum was obligatory. So you force the people to go, even those who do not feel so much committed. So that's why it failed. So what were the 4 main points that led to the crisis? So the first one is abortion. So the convention, very progressive, enshrined the right to abortion in the constitution without any qualification. And that was in March, if I remember correctly. And in March, the support switched, or the opinion switched from positive to negative. So abortion was the one issue that was most very salient. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the private pension system was meant to be abolished in favor of a system of public pension. Now, in general, that's a very positive and important thing, because the private pension system is a pillar of the neoliberal reform, and it seems that it really did havoc to a lot of people in Chile. But at the same time, if you learn that all your private pension will go away for a public system of which you do not know what it will look like, people start to be very concerned. So that was the second one, switching from a private pension system to a public pension system. The third thing then is that it was ending the overrepresentation of conservative forces, so changing what Roberto Gagarella famously calls the machine room of power. And that was because the Senate, which as in the US is a bulwark of conservative forces, that was meant to become a mere Cámara de las Regiones with far less powers. That was the third one. And the fourth one was to turn Chile into a plurinational state. That was the first. So even though the idea to give more rights to indigenous people had wide consent, it somehow went too far, and it became confusing, not least, and that is one of the doctrinal glitches in the constitution, but it was much used. You have the pueblo chileno, and then you have the pueblos originarios. So the singular and the plural, so that confused the mind of many people and helped to mobilize against it. It did not help either that some indigenous people engaged in terrorism at the time so badly that the very progressive President Boric has to send the military. No, so that was not helpful in a situation that you want to give more rights to indigenous people if they engage in terrorist activity so badly that even a very progressive president sends the military. So that are the negative sides. So what is positive? Or what can we learn from it? What can progressive constitutionalism and even any democratic constitutionalism learn from it? Now, I cannot go into any detail here, not least because it's a very thick constitution. Here, I can. It has 388 articles, 57 transitional dispositions, and it's over 178 pages. Now, to be clear, it's not a problem that the constitution is so long, because if it takes broad political agreement to have a constitution, then everything that it takes to have that agreement is worthwhile. It's the same argument that we can do against Dieter Grimm, who says there are too many articles in the European treaties. there is no given length for any constitution. If it takes that type of agreement at the constitutional level, so be it. But that puts a lot on the juridical side. If you have a very complex a document, it takes a lot of juridical skill to have it as a meaningful one. And here there was a problem which Fernandez puts out as precision, consistency, and operationality. So one thing. So what do we learn? I have to hurry up. One thing is to see how many requests by progressive constitutionalism has gone mainstream. Don't forget that the convention had sterling democratic legitimacy, and everything clause was voted by 2/3 of the convention. So it had a very, very broad support. Moreover, it's important to see that Chile has a very long, consolidated, sober, and conservative constitutional culture. That is also why so many countries are looking at Chile. So if something there happens in time of progressive constitutionalism, that is a lesson for the world. So now, what is in it? The first stipulation of all stipulations in the Constitution is to define Chile as a social state. That implements, first of all, the rejections of Pinochet's and US American, we might say, neoliberalism. But there is much more in the Constitution. It builds on the belief that deep inequality is one or perhaps the main reason for many Latin American ills. And I want to highlight that from a guest who has been here last year with the Humboldt, Juliano Zaiden Bembindo. Many of you might remember him being here. He just published a wonderful book on that. It's The Rule of Law in Brazil, the legal construction of inequality. And he really explains the rule of law problems and the democracy problems out of the issue of inequality, not of poverty, but inequality. And we have had that discussions here before, and I think at the end I have some little bombs so that we have a nice discussion. But it's very important. So the inequality issue is very important. So the proposal's response in that respect is really categorical. So it's not just about the social state, but it puts a very great emphasis on substantive equality. Substantive equality. It's a key term that you find throughout the document. But then you have many more things. For example, it requires parity between men and women. It requires a gender focus for all public functions, including judicial interpretation. So we have to do, I think that will be quite a challenge. We have to do all judicial interpretations with a gender focus. And it constitutionalizes many social rights as well as most LGBTQ+ rights. So if you find any right that is requested by that community and you don't find it in this document, you have done a good job. I think it's very difficult to find anything that has not gone there. But the interesting thing was that in the jornadas, that was not really contentious. The issues that were contentious were the four things that I discussed before. So all of that, it was not a big issue, which I found very interesting. But the emphasis of the proposal on rights, it is important. Fundamental human rights have been so important in the tradition of this institution. So the chapter 2 on fundamental rights, it holds 114 articles, establishing rights over 35 pages. So just to give you the comparison, the German constitution holds 17 articles over 7 pages, so 35 to 7, and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, it has 50 articles, but only with 8 pages. So you have 7 pages, 8 pages, and 35 pages. Moreover, the convention uses rights for advancing Chile's ecological transitions. So it provides rights to nature, but even more so, there are also rights to animals, but animals are also subjects. So that is an additional step that the Constitution, the projected Constitution, does. So what to take from that? Well, I think the first thing is that the proposal's focus on rights shows that the rights revolution is well alive and kicking. So that, and that is interesting on many respects. First of all, the main legal theorist of Salvador Allende, Eduardo Monreal, he wrote in 1973 that law is an obstacle to social change. So you see that in the meantime, the idea of what the function of law has completely changed. And the progressive forces there, of course, in the tradition of Salvador Allende. And here, what they enshrine is the experience of the opposition to Chile, which heavily relied on international law in order to oppose, to fight repression. And that historical experience is enshrined in Article 15, which enshrines, which gives international human rights the same rank as the Constitution, but it also, very importantly, enshrines the Inter-American Court of Human Rights doctrines on reparation, and that is the crown of the jurisprudence. Yeah? The doctrines on reparation, that is enshrined by the Chilean Constitution in a projected Constitution article in Article 15. So what we see is that the proposal is surprisingly irresponsive to the critique of rights. And we cannot assume that the convention was ignorant, because many of the convention members, a third had a law degree, were certainly aware of the critique of rights, as many of the Chileans' finest legal minds pass through elite law schools of the global north, where the critique of right is usually formulated. So they know of Susan Marks, they know of David Kennedy, they know of all these people, but nevertheless, you know, they enshrine it. And the same is true with the critique of the specific Latin American rights agenda, which of course has disappointed to some extent, and a famous critique is Roberto Gagarella, but nevertheless, they bet on rights. Although the members of the progressive and those of the critique, they are ideologically and politically very close. It's the same group. Nevertheless, they go for rights. So there must be something in human rights in Latin America that is there to study. Because the assumption that they are just stupid, I think it does not hold. To end, just some so I find it very impressive, although I have some questions. And to conclude, I conclude with Fernandez. So 3 points. One is a mismatch between form and content. So much of what the proposal enshrines, it does so as constitutional rights, but it reads more like a political platform for progressive government. So when you look at it, rights and policies become hard to distinguish. Is that a good development, that rights and policy become indistinguishable? I'm not so sure. A very related question then goes to the question of institutions and agency. The convention bets on rights, but it does not bet on courts. Rather, it is very critical when it comes to courts. And one of the easy ways to attack the proposal was that the convention changed from addressing the courts as el poder judicial, the judicial power, to change that into sistemas de justicia, systems in plural of justice. And that for many said that the proposal was diminishing judicial protection of rights. And indeed, what we see, at least it seems to me, that the proposal puts a trust when it comes to its rights on independent agencies. So for human rights, it's the Defensoría del Pueblo, and for animal rights and nature rights, the Defensoría de la Naturaleza. So in a way, it puts its trust on bureaucracies, on independent bureaucracies. So if that is a good path, it has to be seen. And then as a last point, and then I think we will have the discussion going. And it's so hard that that is for. I wonder whether substantive equality is a meaningful constitutional objective for a country that wants to remain free, that is small, and that is deeply embedded in world economy to pay for all the rights that it puts into the constitution. I think that cannot go, but that is certainly something that we will discuss now. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.